Welcome folks to our next video looking at brain models. So what we're looking at here, just to sort of set you guys up, is we're looking now at the right cerebral hemisphere. So this is just looking at the right half of the brain. So before we look at some of the structures on the outside, let me just quickly review some of the internal structures we talked about in a previous video. If you want more information about the structures that I'm about to mention, please make sure you watch the other video where we refer to the internal structures and what their functions are. But just to very quickly review, in this case, again, we're looking at the right hemisphere. So on the outside, we'll have our gray matter that are making up the various cerebral cortex. And deeper inside, we have the white matter. A very important structure that is highlighted within the white matter is this structure right here. This is called the corpus callosum. This is what allows the communication between the two halves of the brain. Some other structures that you also find around the corpus callosum is going to be the lateral ventricles. We have the thalamus and the third ventricle in this area right here, connected to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. If we work our way down, we're going to go past the pineal gland, through the duct here, connected to the fourth ventricle, and that then goes down through the central canal into the spinal cord. Some of the other structures that you find as we're going further down from the brain here is the cerebellum in the front here, and then we have the pons, which is part of the brain stem. So referring to the brain stem here, we have the midbrain on the top portion, we have the pons, this bulbar structure right here, and the bottom portion is called the medulla oblongata. Again, when it comes to the function of these structures, they're highlighted in much more detail in the other video, so I strongly recommend that all of you watch that. We're now going to flip this model over to highlight some of the outer structures as well as some of the cortices that we learned about in class. So again, just to highlight some of the lobes that are found in the brain itself. In the front, we have the frontal lobe, then we have the parietal lobe, and in the back, we have the occipital lobe. On the side, on the lateral sides, we have the temporal lobe. A very easy way or a simple way to sort of find them or separate these guys is you can use these little invaginations or these little valleys. So between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, we have the central sulcus. This is what separates the two individual lobes. On the side here, we have the lateral sulcus. This is what separates the top lobes, the frontal, the frontal and the parietal from the temporal lobe itself. Now, in terms of the individual lobes and what structures and what functions they carry out, just to highlight, the frontal lobe in this case has a very important structure called the primary motor cortex, or we also sometimes call it the precentral gyrus. This is what's in this case responsible for movement and generating movement or motor actions. So whenever we're trying to move any part of our skeletal muscles in different parts of our body, those signals originate from here and then travel down through the various nerves. Quick correction, I apologize about that. I was pointing at this structure highlighted in deep red as the precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex. I apologize, it is actually this structure right here, label number 29. I just got my bearings right now. So this structure that you see here in sort of light blue, this is the primary motor cortex. This is what's responsible for motor movements of the various skeletal muscles where the signals originate from here. Immediately posterior to that deep red color, this is going to be the primary somatosensory cortex, or what's called the postcentral gyrus. Again, separated between them is that central sulcus right there. In terms of the function associated with the primary somatosensory cortex, which is located in the parietal lobe, this is where all sensory information comes for processing purposes. So as information is coming in from different parts of the body, not just in and around the head, from also the different parts lower below the shoulders, arms, legs, what have you, this is all the information is going to end up here for processing, as well as that process that we refer to as summation, where you try to put all the information together from different parts of your body to sort of get a whole picture of what's going on in the environment around you, what might be falling on or touching, temperature, all kinds of different information ends up here for processing purposes. Now, in terms of what the internal structures of these lobes are besides these cortices, when you go to the frontal lobe itself, it also in this case is responsible for planning future goals, as well as making sure it determines part of what your personality is going to be like. So this is one of the probably the active zones of development of your brain, especially during puberty, as we're trying to figure out how the world's going to be, as we're trying to figure out what our life goals are. A major developmental milestone takes place within the frontal lobe as we're starting to think about our future, what is going to look like, and basically shaping who we're going to be. That's one of the theories, at least, behind what the frontal lobe does. When it comes to the parietal lobe itself, this is primarily, in this case, associated with the processing of sensory information. So we already mentioned the primary somatosensory cortex, but these adjoining areas is what we refer to as those association areas that allows the different lobes to sort of connect as well as send processes between each other, because each lobe in this case is responsible for its own sensory information. So association areas are allowing the different lobes to connect with each other, as well as association areas can also help with the storage of informational memory if required. Working our way back, going past the association area, we are now in the occipital lobe. This is where you find the primary visual cortex. So all information that is coming from our visual system, from the eyes, they're gonna go through the optic chiasm and then gonna end up in the occipital cortex for processing. Occipital lobe, excuse me, for processing, because that's where you find the primary visual cortex. In this case, then we're going to switch over to our last lobe found on the sides, on the laterals. These are called the temporal lobe right here. The temporal lobe in this case is where you find important structures like the hippocampus. You have also, in this case, the two cortices that are responsible for processing of auditory information or hearing, as well as for gustatory information for taste. So in here you have the primary gustatory cortex and you have the primary auditory cortex that is allowing for the processing of taste as well as sound. So taste is obviously going to come from the tongue, go to the thalamus and get processed within the temporal lobe in its corresponding cortex. Auditory information is going to come from individual ears, go to the thalamus, and then come to the temporal lobe, specifically to the primary auditory cortex for further processing. Other than that, again, just to summarize, within the frontal lobe, we have the primary motor cortex. In the parietal lobe, we have the primary somatosensory cortex. All the way in the back, we have the occipital lobe with the primary visual cortex. And then in the temporal lobe, highlighted here in pink, we have the gustatory cortex as well as the primary auditory cortex. With that, we're going to end off our video here. Hopefully you find that helpful. Thanks.